Hello. So I went looking around to find the most popular cartoons today, but since television networks don't really like to share ratings, I wound up on this one particular list that was substantiated by data from TV Time, which is a company that tracks TV watching habits. This list here shows the most popular animated shows on streaming services during 2020. So that's the best I could get, and I think it's a decent place to start in terms of getting to know what the most popular animated content is today across all available streaming services, especially since so many of these services seem very interested in adding a lot of animated stuff, both shows and movies, to entice more subscribers. So in other words, this is not like a completely definitive list of the most popular cartoons currently available. Obviously, the huge animated shows that air on Real TV, Family Guy, and Bob's Burgers, and South Park, those big heavy hitters, would also probably make the list if it wasn't just streaming. But we're going to start here, and it's going to be great. And it's still a good guide to a lot of the most popular animated shows today. For each show, I'm going to give a breakdown of what it is, just in case you're not familiar with it, and then some very brief thoughts of my own on each show. And then at the very end, I'll talk about some very light analysis in regards to trends in animation based on this list and the shows that made it on. Okay, that's enough. Here we go. The Midnight Gospel is a show from Adventure Time creator Pendleton Ward and comedian Duncan Trussell. Basically, Trussell talks to somewhat famous or spiritual people in real life, and then an animation team creates wacky visuals to keep the audience from falling asleep, but most of the dialogue, quote unquote, is basically just a conversation between two people. Now, how do I feel about it? So I made a couple of videos about this show when it first came out. A lot of people got mad at me for the first video in particular, which is fine. It's just not a very good show, in my opinion. If you'd like to get all the details of how I feel about it, you can check out either of those videos. However, I think a lot of people connected with the show because it makes you feel like you're learning something even when you're not, and it opens your mind to some new ideas and ways of thinking about the world and the nature of existence. And if it does that for you, then I'm glad. I think that's genuinely positive, and that's cool. Didn't do that for me, but if it does it for you, that's great. With all of its problems, I think it still deserves a decent amount of credit for being somewhat original too. I mean, it's kind of like the Ricky Gervais show and being just like an illustrated podcast, just with a lot less annoying cackling. Big Mouth. Oh, Big Mouth. Yes, here we are at number 9. Well, it's a show where adult comedians voice kids who are going through puberty, and this serves as a way to talk about specific aspects of sex education that don't usually get discussed in detail in real life, and the show has gotten very popular. I think it's on, the 4th or 5th season by this point, which is kind of crazy. And how I feel about Big Mouth is I hate it. I've never made a full video talking about this, but my reasons are really nothing special. The show is extremely ugly, just visually. The sense of humor is very easy and not appealing to me, and I still don't know who the show thinks its core audience is. It feels very split between content specifically for adults and content for kids who are currently going through puberty. At the same time, I think I have a pretty good idea of why people like it. For one, the tone of Big Mouth is very similar to that of Family Guy and other trashy animated comedies, and those tend to be very popular just in general. I also think Big Mouth has a do-gooder halo around it, since apparently people think this show is helping out by referencing vague ideas in sex education. I don't think it does, but maybe kids actually are getting something out of this show, and if they are, that's cool. Number 8 is Baki. Here's the breakdown. It's an anime show about guys who fight. But since it is an anime, everything is way more extreme than you might be picturing. The show is just always turned up to 11, and it can be kind of tiring, honestly. For me, I'm not crazy about the show, but I can also respect it for what it is. It's not trying to do anything spectacular or innovative. It's all just about dumb violence and a bunch of people who basically have superpowers because they're just so strong. Actually, I wouldn't be surprised if this is how people who are really into MMA see themselves, Joe Rogan in particular. Okay, number 7 is Paradise PD, which is a Netflix original. It's an animated comedy about some very clumsy and awful police officers. If you haven't seen it yet, it probably wouldn't surprise you in any way. Whatever you're picturing about it right now, based on the imagery, you pretty much have it nailed down. A lot of people have already talked about how bad this show is, and I tend to agree with them. Still, I don't think it's really that much worse than something like Family Guy. I mean, can you tell that I don't have a lot of love for Family Guy? The saddest part might just be that Kyle Kinane is part of the main cast, and I really like his stand-up. I even like some of the voice acting stuff he's done on other shows, especially on Adventure Time. He was in there for a couple episodes during the Stakes miniseries. I'm glad he's getting paid here, but it just kind of grosses me out to see him working on this. Like, and you don't need to watch this show. You don't. You really don't. Number 6 is F is for Family, another Netflix original. They have quite a few on this list, in fact, as we'll soon find out. If you don't know what it is a family sitcom from stand-up comedian Bill Burr, and that's pretty much it. It takes place in the 1970s. Everything else is kind of by the book. I actually like Bill Burr okay. There are definitely times when his stand-up moves a little too close to like conspiracy theories and men's rights culture, but he's a funny guy. Even so, F is for Family never impressed me. I don't like the art style, the stories don't interest me, and as plenty of other people have mentioned, it seems like the show was only set in the 70s so that they could get away with saying certain things that we don't say anymore, using certain words. I'll leave it at that. When I imagine the audience for F is for Family, I basically picture the same kind of audience that would be into Big Mouth or Family Guy. It's a similar sense of humor. It's probably mostly kids or just adults who happen to like lowbrow humor, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I can also see why Netflix greenlit the project in the first place. It kind of seems like an easy yes on that level. Number 5, here we're getting into the top half here, and it's Castlevania, yet another Netflix original animated series, and another anime series as well, or the style of anime. It's a show based on the old Castlevania video games, obviously. A lot of people love those games. I haven't played them. Sorry. It's definitely meant for an adult audience thanks to the graphic violence and the language and the subject matter. And for me, I'm not usually super excited about shows or movies based on video games, most often because the actual connections to the games are minimal, or because not a ton of games really support an intricate narrative adaptation. Also, a lot of video game adaptations just haven't been very good historically. They could be. I absolutely think they could be, and I made a whole video about it a long time ago, but generally no. As for this one, I think it's actually pretty neat, at least based on the 3 episodes of it that I watched. It's a cool setting. It's a decent premise, and the villain is reasonably sympathetic, which is a nice surprise, even if that sympathy just boils down to the classic dead wife character motivation. The 4th most popular here is Harley Quinn, which is exclusive to the DC Universe streaming service, which I'm sure at least 200 people subscribe to. It's a very adult-oriented adaptation about Harley Quinn, kind of doing her own thing, moving away from being a sidekick to Joker, and I mean, in that way, it does feel awful similar to Suicide Squad or Birds of Prey, but whatever, at least it's animated, and I think that's an advantage. It's definitely not as ugly as the recent DC movies either. I didn't watch very much of this one, but I can say that I liked it okay. There are times when it feels like they're trying way too hard to be edgy and different, but I also think that approach works a lot better with this visual style and in animation in general as opposed to a live action movie. Visually, it definitely feels a bit like Batman the Animated Series, which is always a good thing because that is a great show. I probably will not finish this, but I'm fine with it, and I totally understand the appeal. I'm glad that DC fans are getting something of quality here. Number 3. So this is another Netflix one. This is another Netflix original animated series. I guess it's like a co-venture with DreamWorks, which apparently DreamWorks has moved away from animated features in a big way, like they did the How to Train Your Dragon sequels. But outside of that, they really haven't. Illumination has kind of taken up the reins of ugly and dated animated kids movies. But anyway, this show is Shira. and the Princesses of Power. Not a great name, huh? If you don't know it, it's a show set in the He-Man universe, the He-Man toy universe, but He-Man doesn't show up in this show. It's actually about Adora, who is a young girl who then becomes the sort of mythical hero Shira, and it's all about how she has to fight to save her magical home planet. So I'll give you a couple seconds to guess how I felt about this one. Well, I'll put it this way. I love it. I love it so much. This show. Have you seen this show? Guys, internet people who have found their way to this video, have you seen this show? I'm not gonna go on a whole big thing. Like, it's not mind-blowing. I won't go that far. It's not like the best thing I've ever seen. It's not vying for a top spot in my heart, but it's really good. It's a very, very good animated show, and I absolutely didn't expect that. Probably because, well, for one, the title's bad. I still think it's very bad and too long and hard to say. And I've definitely seen like the cover art floating around Netflix at some point. I'm sure that within seconds I was just turned off from the show because, like, ew, oh, look, oh, like it seemed very much like this is just a show for little girls, and that's fine, but it's not really for me. I'm never gonna touch it. And then, just for the purposes of doing this video, I sat down to watch a couple episodes, and I think maybe after the first 15 minutes of the very first episode, I was so on board that I ended up spending the next day watching the entire series. I'm done. I'm caught up. It's over, and I loved it. In terms of tone and storyline and kind of even visuals, it reminded me a lot of the old Teen Titans series as well as Avatar. Kind of feels that way of just like, oh, here's some teens, some of them got powers, and they're going to go on a big globe-trotting adventure, and there's a big bad guy that they have to face down. Lots of similarities between those shows, but it still has its own unique identity, and it doesn't talk down to its audience, even though it stays family friendly and simple enough, at least on the surface level, for kids to follow. I'm just kind of amazed that this works so well, and I have a huge amount of respect for the people who worked on this show, and I have even more respect for the fact that apparently they're just stopping after the end of season 5. They just said, you know what, that's where the story ends, we're just gonna stop for now. That doesn't happen. No one does that. No one does that. And I can already feel this dragging, and I'm gonna say right now, I have so much to say about the show. I have to give it its own full video because there's so much there, and I'm so incredibly surprised that I connected with it in any real way. We've just got to move on. At number 2, we have another Netflix original animated show called Bojack Horseman. Well, if you're over the age of 15, you've probably already heard of the show by this point. It's done now. It finished up, what? Was that the very beginning of this year, or was it the very beginning of 2019? Either way, it's done now forever, and I really hope they don't try to do any big spin-offs. Even Tuca and Birdie kind of was a spin-off, and that died super fast, didn't it? But if you're somehow unfamiliar with the show, Bojack Horseman is about a former sitcom star who happens to be a horse, it's not super important, who has tons of substance abuse issues and is generally not in a good place mentally. And it gets dark. It's very dark. It's very much for adults. It's very dark, and as you might have already guessed, this is probably kind of predictable, but Bojack is definitely one of my favorite animated shows ever, and a lot of that has to do with its excellent writing and its willingness to explore very, very uncomfortable subject matter at times, all of which is relevant to modern life and the entertainment industry today. And even if you don't happen to live in LA or work in the industry or have a history in sitcom television yourself, it's pretty impressive how easily you can relate to one or more of the characters and the stuff they're going through. It also somehow stayed fresh and vital every time that it came back with a new season, and in my opinion, it picked a very good time to bow out. I'm tempted to make whole videos talking about like specific episodes and characters, but the Bojack YouTube market has been cornered by like a handful of channels who really just have made the show their bread and butter. So I think I'll just be staying away from that in the future, but it's almost subjective at this point. Like it was a good show. It's very impressive, and I'm not surprised that people are still watching it a whole lot. And finally, at number 1, we have The Simpsons. Go figure. Now, it looks like right now some of the more recent seasons are streaming on Hulu, but I think every season is available now on Disney Plus because Disney owns Fox. It was a Fox property. And the breakdown. Do you need a breakdown of The Simpsons? You know what it is. It's an animated sitcom that used to be groundbreaking and subversive, and for many years now, it's just been limping along on its way to the grave. Personally, I really like the first 12 or so seasons of The Simpsons, and I can definitely see why it's been so popular on streaming services, Disney Plus especially. It's a little bit more adult, for sure, but it's still mostly family friendly. And for anyone who grew up with the show, there's a crazy amount of nostalgia associated with seeing those very early seasons, especially because they were animated on actual paper, so they just immediately look more warm and faded and old and wonderful. So while these 10 shows are just a sampling of the most popular cartoons today, they also represent a decent cross-section of viewing habits and interests when it comes to animation. That's why we're going to close this out with a quick rundown of lessons, I guess we could call them, that we can glean from this list of shows. First up, streaming is the new home of animation. This is definitely the most obvious lesson, I think. Streaming services are currently, and will continue to be, the new home for animated television. And that doesn't mean that the biggest shows that are on traditional TV are going away necessarily, or that they're not relevant or anything like that. But if we look at those huge shows, there were really never all that many of them. You have the Fox animation domination stuff, Simpsons, Family Guy, Bob's Burgers, and a few other ones that didn't last quite as long. South Park for sure. These really big shows that have had very long lives thus far. And then like Rick and Morty and a handful of like kind of fringy stuff that has caught on, but a lot of other animated TV shows never hit it quite as big as these ones, and as such, major networks weren't likely to order more of them. But streaming services frequently produce smaller projects, and that's why we even have a lot of the shows that appeared on this list. In fact, the only show on the list that isn't a streaming exclusive is The Simpsons, and I would argue that most people are only watching it now on streaming services. And since streaming services are producing animated content that isn't exclusively broad comedy meant to appeal to a huge number of people, we're also getting a greater variety of animated content. We're still getting animated comedies, sure, and I think it's safe to say that those will always be the biggest ones, but we're also getting action and drama and fantasy and sci-fi and, in a way, basically talk radio with like the Midnight Gospel. I really doubt we would have ever gotten such a range of animated entertainment if the traditional TV hierarchy was still dominant. Next up, visual excellency is the exception, not the norm. An animated show doesn't need to look great to be great. Shows can do all kinds of things to tell compelling stories without also wowing us with its visuals. Based on this list, killer visuals are not very common, and on a practical level, this makes a lot of sense. Animation is time and labor intensive to begin with, and animation for a show instead of a movie means that the deadlines are a lot tighter. You've got to complete a lot more stuff in a lot less time. I completely understand why a lot of animated shows don't look all that great. I'm fine with it, but that also makes it really special when I find an animated show that always just looks stunning and it's just great to look at. So while I wish that shows like Big Mouth and Paradise PD looked a lot better, for example, I'm not really gonna hold my breath. And that's all I've got. I wish there was a third lesson just to make it kind of rounded out, but I've got nothing. So why don't you tell me what we can learn from this list of very popular cartoons down in the comment area down there where you can type whatever you want. And I think I'll go watch some Shira again. And you should too. All right, bye.